done. But first, we're joined online by Olivia Enos. She's the Senior Policy Analyst for Heritage Foundation in their Asian Studies Center, and she joins us on the line to discuss the fact that yesterday was the 70th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. President Trump, of course, sent a sort of congratulatory note about that. He was not the first president to do so. Obama has too, but this is one of the great tragic instances in human history, was the takeover of China by the Communist Party. Olivia, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So obviously, as the Chinese Communist Party is marking its 70th year, they've sent off the year in fine fashion by shooting demonstrators in Hong Kong. Maybe you can give us the update from what's going on in Hong Kong.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, Ben, there was the shooting for the very first time of a Hong Kong protester by Hong Kong security force officials. It was a very difficult skirmish between both protesters and security officials. As those protests have lingered on, they have started to trend a little bit more toward violence. But I want to emphasize and underscore that in large part, the Hong Kong protests have been peaceful, and the desires of the Hong Kong people and the reason why they're taking to the streets is primarily to preserve liberty there. And I think that many of the protesters recognize that engaging in violent activities or having violence perpetrated against them is not in their interest. And so I think this is why one of the primary calls from Hong Kong protesters is this request that there be an independent inquiry undertaken to investigate the police brutality that has taken place since these protests began several months ago.
Well, where is that inquiry going to go? I mean, the fact is that the Chinese government has no real interest in doing that sort of inquiry. What's the court of final appeal here, other than just the world community?
Well, I think it is important to remember that Hong Kong is an autonomous region, and as such, it does have an independent judiciary that actually, up until this point, has remained largely independent from Beijing's authorities. Of course, there's always fear and concern that Beijing at any moment could intervene either in the legal and judicial system, or, of course, early on in the protests, there were some fears that Beijing might consider some form of military intervention. We haven't seen that thus far. But nonetheless, I think that Hong Kongers are taking to the street, and they have 5 core demands. Just to highlight a couple of them, one is universal suffrage. One is, that call for an independent inquiry. Another is that the protests not be referred to as riots. And so I think the Hong Kong people recognize that they do have a certain amount of power, and they want to hold the Hong Kong government itself accountable so that they don't have a situation where Beijing is in fact exercising greater authority over Hong Kong and really violating the fundamental and first freedoms that Hong Kongers typically enjoy. We're
speaking with Olivia Enos. She's Senior Policy Analyst at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. So, Olivia, when you talk about the history of the Communist Party in China, obviously this week we saw President Trump sort of pay a brief homage to the current regime in Beijing. And he's not the first president to do that. Obama did it too. Why is it that so many in the West seem willing to tip their caps to what has been one of the most brutal regimes in the history of mankind?
This is a real travesty. There should never be any positive acknowledgement of the Chinese Communist Party. The long history from the Cultural Revolution where millions of people died. It's so important to be reminded that communism itself has killed millions of people, not just in Asia, but all across the globe. And I think this often gets lost, that actually more people have died as a consequence of communism than died as a consequence of Nazism or during the Holocaust. And so there should be equal fervor in condemning communism. Of course, in China, we've seen this turn toward even deeper authoritarianism under the current president, Xi Jinping, who has just last year, for example, instituted new regulations on religious affairs that make it so that people of all faiths, whether Muslim, Christian, Catholic, or Falun Gong, which is a smaller religious subset inside of China, that they are not able to freely practice their religion. Instead, their religion has to conform to the Chinese Communist Party's ends through a process called sinicization. This is an attempt to secularize religion and to remove those fundamental first freedoms from average Chinese who should otherwise be able to practice freely their religious beliefs according to their conscience.
Well, talking about sort of some of the human rights violations in which the Chinese government has engaged, obviously President Trump has taken a very strong stance against the Chinese with regard to trade infringement. Now, he's been a little bit less overt in his calls on the Chinese with regard to human rights. In fact, I can't recall him actually speaking overtly about the Chinese and human rights. In fact, I think Obama tended to do that a little bit more often. But what are some of the bigger human rights violations in which they are currently engaged? You know, people have heard sort of the Uyghur Muslims or the Rohingya genocide. People don't know much about these things.
Yeah, that's so true. So there are between 1 and 3 million Uyghur Muslims who are held in political re-education facilities today. Some of them have disappeared and their families have not heard from them. We've heard reports of torture, in some cases forced labor inside those political camps. And so what you have seen is just a really awful, awful situation where these individuals are being collectivized, not unlike how we saw the communist regime act under the Cultural Revolution. And of course, we're also seeing Christian pastors, human rights lawyers, Tibetan Buddhists facing increasing persecution. And we're seeing China in particular using new and emerging technologies as an extension of its authoritarian policies, instituting something called the social credit system, as well as various surveillance technologies that essentially monitor the every move of the Chinese people. And what's even more terrifying is that these surveillance technologies are already being exported across the globe and being deployed by other authoritarian governments for the purposes of them to surveil their own citizens and violate their own citizens' rights.
Well, this is Olivia Enos, Senior Policy Analyst at the Heritage Foundation. Olivia, really appreciate your time, and thanks for throwing some light on what is a continuing human rights travesty that we should all obviously be mourning, not celebrating, on the 70th anniversary of the takeover of China by the Communist Party. Olivia, really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Ben.